Well, hello, and welcome back to Men's Fraternity. I hope you've enjoyed a week off and got some rest and relaxation, but I'll say that I'm really glad to be back with you as we continue our study through the book of Called to Lead by John MacArthur. Today we're going to look at chapter 7 and answer the question, who is sufficient to lead? We'll continue looking at the Apostle Paul's life, and specifically we'll look in Corinthians. Paul is writing really to address the attack from false teachers who've infiltrated the church at Corinth. And so we'll see in the text that we look at today that Paul really seems reluctant to even want to give a defense. We see his humility in that, but understands the necessity of it so that his name is not discredited, and more importantly, that the name of Christ is not discredited. So the first point I want to make for us today is that Satan wants to discredit true Christian leaders. We see it in the Old Testament. If you remember back in chapter 2, we looked at Nehemiah, and they wanted to. He needed to bring credit of who he was with himself. And there's always going to be folks that are looking for that. In the Old Testament, we see Satan attacking Moses with Korah, the rebel who just organized that revolt against Moses. We see it in Absalom, the son of David, who wanted to rebel against him and have an uprising. We see it in the New Testament. We're looking at it today in the book of 2 Corinthians. We see it in the Gospels, those that wanted to attack Christ for who he was and all. So don't be surprised by the fact that Satan wants to attack and discredit you as a true Christian leader. Don't be surprised by it, and understand it often starts with an attack on our character. So I want to read from 2 Corinthians 3, verses 1 through 5. It says, "Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need as some letters of commendation to you or from you? You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such confidence we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God." True Christian leaders don't forget those they lead, even in difficult times, even when they're going to face opposition. And here Paul is facing these attacks by false teachers who have infiltrated the church, and he could have very well just went on. But he knew that his name, but more importantly the name of Christ, was going to be discredited if he did that. They tried to discredit his character. So while it may hurt and be hard to have to deal with it, I think it's fair that we ask this question of ourselves. What does my character say about me to those I lead? I find it very interesting that in this text, the first place Paul went to defend himself was to challenge the Corinthians to look at his character, to look back at the time he had spent with them and what they had seen in his life, and did it match what he was teaching. Could you do that? Could you say, "Man, you know me. Think about me. You know my character. That's not true." What those you lead say about you when you aren't present says a lot about your character, good or bad. Paul was saying, you can look back at my character. You can look back at the months and the years that I spent with you, and you should be able to answer these attacks from these false teachers who have come in. You know me. Do those you lead know you? Do they know your true heart? Paul's next point in defending himself to the Corinthians was just his influence. Many times we look at letters of commendation or letters of recommendation. Nehemiah took a letter of recommendation as he went to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. Paul himself in Acts chapter 9 had letters of commendation so that he could arrest and bring prisoners back to Jerusalem. We think about Acts chapter 16. Paul writes a letter for the deaconess Phoebe to give her credit as she moved forward. We think about it today. We see letters of recommendation written for job applications, or like Landon, he's recently had several letters of recommendation written for scholarship opportunities. So this was a common practice then as it is today. But notice what Paul says to the Corinthians. He's saying, I shouldn't need to give you a written letter. I shouldn't need to give you a written letter. My letter is written on your hearts and my heart for you. The false teachers came with all kinds of recommendations from Jerusalem, from the church in Jerusalem, from all over. And it was really common practice that they wouldn't stay in a place for very long, but they would stay just long enough to get a recommendation letter so that they could move on, to give them credit to spread that disease throughout the church as fast and as quickly as they could. And so Paul's response was really, do you need a recommendation letter from anyone for me? Think of the influence that I've had on your life. What does the influence that I've had on your life say about me? That's what Paul's saying to the Corinthians. Look at your lives and the influence I had on you. Doesn't that say enough? Do people need a recommendation letter on you? Or does your influence and impact on their lives say enough? Not only did Paul remind them of his character and his influence, but then he points them to his calling. True leaders are sure of their calling. In 2 Corinthians 3:4, Paul explained that he was certain of his calling. What has the Lord called you to do? Preach, teach, fix cars, fix air conditioners, finances, accounting. I can't say for each of you, but I do know that God's called me to preach, and I have to do it. Embrace your calling. I think that's what we can learn from Paul. Paul had embraced his calling and be wholeheartedly devoted to the task that's at hand, whatever that may be. You won't be a successful leader if you're considering the current task as a stepping stone for the next. You can't be distracted by the future and effectively lead in the present. When I was in the military, it was always interesting to see those who desired to be a chief master sergeant. There were some who were really effective at leading where they were, and they became chief master sergeants who people respected, who they had influence on their lives. But then there were some who worked really hard to be chief master sergeant while forgetting the task that was at hand. They would get busy doing the things, the check boxes that needed to be checked so that they could make chief master sergeant. And then when they became chief master sergeants, oftentimes we called them chief master sergeants or E9s, not chief. That's what Paul is saying here. Embrace your calling, embrace where the Lord has you, and take care of the task that is at hand. Finally, true leaders are humble. They give credit where credit is due. Paul said here, he said, our sufficiency is from God. Paul knew his limitations. He recognized his giftings, but he gave God praise for his gifts. He knew his limitations and he gave credit to God where God filled in. Just as we were starting this video, Don Stevens was telling me some things about it and asking me what I want to do, and I said, I'm going to trust you with that. My limitations are very limited when it comes to video technology and how to get things in front of you. And so knowing your weaknesses is important if you're going to be a true, effective Christian leader. What are your weaknesses? The leader who doesn't know his weaknesses is doomed to fail. In closing, I just want to share what MacArthur says on page 103 in your books. It says, no competent leader is going to be anxious to impress people with his credentials. Leaders who are truly able are qualified because of their character. They are easily identified not by letters of commendation, but because of the influence they have on others. They are people who are confident of their calling, and yet at the same time they know they are utterly dependent on God as the source of their true power. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you soon.